The ink had barely dried on the last page when the knock came. Genevieve lifted her quill from the manuscript she'd been copying since dawn, a shipping contract for a wool merchant who paid 3 shillings per page and always complained about her margins. Her fingers were stained black at the tips, her hair loosely pinned with a wooden clip she'd carved herself, and the collar of her grey cotton dress had started to fray at the seam again. She looked, by every measure, like a woman who had made peace with a quiet and forgettable life. The knock came again, harder this time. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the small front room of the cottage, stepping over a stack of unbound pages drying near the hearth. The place smelled of walnut ink and cold tea. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, she could make out the shape of a tall figure, and behind him, the unmistakable outline of a 4-horse carriage parked along the narrow lane. Nobody in Oakhaven owned a 4-horse carriage. She opened the door. The man standing on her step was dressed in a dark green riding coat with brass buttons, polished boots that had never touched a farm road, and a silk cravat tied with the kind of precision that only came from having a valet. His jaw was clean-shaven, his dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, and he carried a leather document case under one arm, as though he'd come to conduct business at a banking house rather than a village cottage. "Miss Genevieve Ashford," he said. "Who is asking?" "Lord Thaddeus Vane, Duke of the Western Maritime Province." He paused, then added with the faintest trace of impatience, "May I come in?" Genevieve studied him for a long moment. She had heard the name before. The Vane family controlled a large share of the English coastal trade, and their estate sat on the hilltop roughly 4 miles north of Oakhaven. She had never once seen any member of the family visit the village in person. She stepped aside and let him through. Lord Thaddeus entered the cottage and immediately had to duck beneath a low beam. He glanced around at the small writing desk, the ink-stained cloth draped over it, the shelf of borrowed books, and the single window that let in a square of weak morning light. If the modesty of the place surprised him, he was disciplined enough to hide it. "I'll be direct with you," he said, setting his document case on the edge of her table. "I am in considerable trouble, and I've been told you are the most well-spoken and well-read woman in this parish." "By whom?" "Your former music tutor, Mr. Fenton. He serves on a choral committee that occasionally performs at my estate chapel." Genevieve's expression shifted. She hadn't spoken to old Fenton in over a year, and the mention of her musical past sent a thin wire of tension through her chest. She folded her arms. "What sort of trouble requires a well-spoken transcriber, Lord Vane?" Thaddeus opened the document case and produced a letter bearing the crimson seal of the High Council of Barons. He laid it flat on the table and turned it so she could read. "In 6 days," he said, "I am required to appear before the High Council Assembly at the Chancellor's Palace in Blackthorn. The purpose of the Assembly is to review my family's maritime trading license, a license that has been held by the Vane household for 3 generations. Without it, I lose access to every major English port, and my family's entire shipping operation collapses within a year." Genevieve scanned the letter. The language was formal, layered with legal phrasing, but the message underneath was clear. The council expected Lord Thaddeus to attend the assembly as a man of full social standing, which, according to the traditions of the Maritime Guild, meant presenting himself with a wife or formally betrothed companion. "You need a wife," Genevieve said. "I need a woman who can pass as one." She looked up at him. "For a week?" "For exactly 7 days, from this morning through the final evening of the assembly celebrations. You will accompany me to every public function, every formal dinner, every promenade and reception. You will be introduced as Lady Genevieve of Oakhaven, a minor noble title, plausible enough to avoid deep scrutiny. You will carry yourself with grace, speak with intelligence, and under absolutely no circumstance will you reveal that our arrangement is contractual." "And what happens after the 7 days?" "You return to this cottage with a full settlement of every outstanding debt your late father left behind. I've already had my solicitor confirm the amount, £14, 6 shillings, owed to 3 separate creditors, all of whom are growing impatient." The number landed like a stone dropped into still water. £14 was more than Genevieve could earn in an entire year of transcription work. She had been carrying that debt since her father's death 2 winters ago, and every month the letters from the creditors grew shorter and colder in tone. She turned away from him and walked toward the window. The lane outside was empty. A blackbird sat on the fence post near her small herb garden, tilting its head at nothing. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Surely you have relations, acquaintances, women of actual standing who would benefit from an arrangement like this." "I have considered every option available to me within my social circle, and each one carries a political complication I cannot afford. I need someone with no existing ties to the aristocracy. Someone educated enough to hold her own in conversation, but invisible enough that no one at the assembly will have met her before." Genevieve turned back to face him. "You need a ghost." "I need a convincing one." She was quiet for a long time. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the room had grown cold without her noticing. Outside, the coachman shifted his weight on the driver's bench, and the horses stamped restlessly against the packed earth. There were a dozen reasons to refuse: the risk of exposure, the humiliation if she were caught, the suffocating memory of the last time she had stood before powerful men and watched her entire world be taken from her with a single accusation. And yet, £14 meant freedom. It meant silence from the creditors. It meant one less thing pressing on her chest when she tried to sleep. "I'll need proper clothing," she said. "Already arranged." "And a private room at the manor. I won't share quarters under a false pretense." "You'll have the East Guest Suite. It overlooks the garden." "And when it's over, you'll sign the settlement in front of a solicitor, witnessed and sealed." "Agreed." Genevieve untied her apron and draped it across the back of her chair. She looked once more around the cottage, at the half-finished manuscript, the cold cup of tea, the quiet little life she had built from the wreckage of the one that came before. Then she picked up her travelling case from behind the door, the one she hadn't opened in 3 years, and followed Lord Thaddeus out into the morning light. The carriage door closed behind her, and the horses began to move. She didn't look back. The carriage turned off the main road just past the old stone bridge and climbed a private lane lined with elm trees whose branches met overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. Genevieve had seen Vane Manor from a distance before. Everyone in Oakhaven had. But sitting inside the iron gates and watching the house rise ahead of her was something else entirely. The manor was 3 stories of pale limestone, with tall sash windows, a columned portico, and ivy creeping up the eastern wall in careful, manicured lines. The grounds stretched in every direction, a manicured lawn to the south, a walled kitchen garden to the west, and beyond the tree line, the grey shimmer of the English Channel catching the last of the afternoon sun. A footman opened the carriage door before Genevieve could reach for the handle herself. "Mrs. Hatchett will meet you in the drawing room," Thaddeus said as he stepped down behind her. "She manages the household and has been informed of the arrangement. She is the only member of staff who knows the truth, and it will remain that way." "And what does Mrs. Hatchett think of your plan?" Thaddeus paused on the gravel. "She thinks I've gone mad, but she has served this family for 26 years and has never once let her opinion interfere with her duties." The entrance hall smelled of beeswax polish and dried lavender. A wide staircase curved upward beneath a brass chandelier fitted with 24 candles, and the floor tiles were black and white marble arranged in a diamond pattern that made the space feel twice its actual size. Genevieve kept her chin level and her hands clasped in front of her. She had walked through grand houses before, in another life. The trick was to look as though the grandeur belonged to you rather than the other way around. Mrs. Hatchett was waiting beside the fireplace in the drawing room. She was a compact woman of perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe knot and spectacles perched on the end of a narrow nose. She wore a plain black dress with a chatelaine of household keys hanging from her waist, and she studied Genevieve the way a jeweler studies a stone before deciding whether to cut or discard it. "Stand up straight, if you please," Mrs. Hatchett said, before Genevieve had even fully entered the room. Genevieve straightened. "Turn." She turned. Mrs. Hatchett circled her once, slowly, examining the line of her shoulders, the way her weight settled on her feet, the position of her hands. Then she picked up a small leather notebook from the side table and opened it to a page dense with handwriting. We have 5 days before the first formal engagement at Blackthorn Springs. In that time, I intend to confirm whether you are capable of surviving polite society without disgracing this household. I will assess your knowledge of table protocol, forms of address, conversational etiquette, current noble genealogies, the correct management of a dance card, and the proper way to enter and exit a room when accompanied by a gentleman of title. She closed the notebook. We begin now. What followed was the most thorough examination Genevieve had faced since her years at the conservatory. Mrs. Hatchett fired questions across the room like a barrister at trial, the correct order of precedence when seating a bishop beside a baron's widow, the difference between a curtsy offered to a countess and one offered to a duchess, the appropriate length of time to hold eye contact with a gentleman during an introduction. Genevieve answered every one. When Mrs. Hatchett placed a soup spoon, a fish knife, and 3 crystal glasses on the dining table and asked her to identify the correct sequence of use at a 6-course supper, Genevieve arranged them without hesitation and then adjusted the angle of the bread plate by a 1/4 inch because Mrs. Hatchett had set it slightly too far to the left. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose by a fraction. "And if a viscount asks you to dance a second set before the first intermission?" Mrs. Hatchett asked. I decline graciously and explain that my card is already committed, regardless of whether it is. A second dance before intermission suggests an intimacy that would invite comment. And if the host's wife speaks to you first at the start of a dinner? I respond warmly but briefly and allow her to set the tone of the conversation. It would be inappropriate for a guest of lesser standing to direct the exchange. Mrs. Hatchett closed her notebook and placed it on the mantel. She removed her spectacles and cleaned them with a small cloth, taking her time. The fire crackled quietly in the grate. "Where on earth did you learn all of this?" she asked. "My father was a composer," Genevieve said. "He spent 30 years writing for the finest houses in the south of England. I grew up attending rehearsals in drawing rooms and dining halls that belonged to earls and admirals and members of the High Court. I may not carry a title, but I have spent more hours inside rooms like this one than most women who do." Mrs. Hatchett studied her for a long moment, then turned to Thaddeus, who had been standing near the doorway with his arms folded and his mouth very slightly open. "She'll do," Mrs. Hatchett said. Thaddeus cleared his throat. "You're satisfied then?" "I said she'll do, Lord Vane. I did not say I was satisfied. Satisfaction requires performance under pressure, and we have yet to see that." She turned back to Genevieve. "The gowns are being delivered tomorrow from a dressmaker in Bridport. 3 evening dresses, 2 day dresses, 1 riding habit, and appropriate undergarments. You will be fitted in the morning." Genevieve nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Hatchett." The housekeeper gave a short, clipped nod in return and left the room, her keys jingling faintly against her hip. Thaddeus waited until the door had closed before speaking. "You corrected her bread plate. It was in the wrong position." He stared at her. "I hired a transcriber from a village cottage, and she just corrected the etiquette of a woman who has run a duke's household for a 1/4 of a century." Genevieve met his gaze evenly. "You hired someone to be convincing, Lord Vane. I suggest you stop being surprised when I am." He held her look for a beat longer than was comfortable, then something shifted behind his eyes, a quiet reassessment, the kind that happens when a man realizes the ground beneath him is steadier than he feared. "Your room is the second door on the east landing," he said. "Supper is at 8. I'll send someone to show you the way." He left without another word, and Genevieve stood alone in the vast, firelit drawing room, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She allowed herself one slow breath. Then she walked to the window and looked out across the darkening grounds toward the distant sea. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a world she had once belonged to was still turning without her. And in 5 days, she was going to walk straight back into the middle of it. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and whispered to no one at all, "Don't you dare fall apart." Blackthorn Springs had been fashionable since the last century, when a physician to the royal household declared its mineral waters capable of curing gout, melancholy, and poor digestion in equal measure. Whether the waters actually worked was a matter of opinion, but the resort's true purpose had never really been medical. It was a stage, a place where the titled families of southern England came to be seen, to measure one another, and to settle old grudges behind the thinnest curtain of civility. The promenade ran along a limestone terrace overlooking the spring gardens, shaded by a row of ornamental limes. At one end stood the pump room, where guests drank the sulphurous water from shallow porcelain cups and pretended to enjoy it. At the other end, a string quartet played beneath a white canvas awning, while ladies in muslin dresses drifted between conversation groups like boats adjusting to the current. Genevieve stepped out of the carriage, wearing a pale blue silk day dress with a fitted bodice and ivory lace at the collar. Mrs. Hatchett had supervised every detail that morning, the angle of her bonnet, the selection of her gloves, even the way she carried her parasol. The dress had been cut by the Bridport dressmaker with remarkable speed, and it fit Genevieve as though the woman had somehow measured her in a dream. Thaddeus offered his arm. She took it. "Smile," he murmured, as they approached the terrace steps. "But only slightly. Too much warmth and they'll think you're nervous." "I know how to smile at aristocrats, Lord Vane." "Thaddeus, if we're betrothed, you'll need to use my Christian name." She glanced sideways at him. "Thaddeus, then." They entered the promenade together, and the effect was immediate. Heads turned, subtly at first, then with open curiosity. A duke arriving with a woman nobody recognized was the kind of event that could fuel drawing-room conversation for weeks. The first to approach was Lady Whitmore, a baronet's wife with a thin smile and a reputation for asking the questions everyone else was too polite to voice. "Lord Vane, what a pleasure. And who is this delightful creature you've brought with you?" "Lady Whitmore, may I present Miss Genevieve Ashford of Oakhaven, my betrothed." Lady Whitmore's eyes widened by exactly the amount she intended them to. "Oakhaven? How charming. I confess I don't believe I've heard the name Ashford in connection with that part of the county." "My family kept a modest estate there for many years," Genevieve said. "We were never much interested in society, I'm afraid. My father preferred his music to his social calendar." "A musician?" Lady Whitmore said the word, as though tasting something she hadn't quite decided about. "A composer. He wrote several choral works for the cathedral at Salisbury." This was true, and it was the kind of detail that couldn't easily be checked on the spot, but sounded impressive enough to close the line of questioning. Lady Whitmore tilted her head, offered a gracious nod, and moved on. Over the next hour, Genevieve was introduced to more than a dozen members of the regional aristocracy. She kept her answers brief and warm, volunteered very little about herself, and asked just enough about each person to make them feel interesting. It was a skill she had learned long ago. People rarely scrutinized someone who made them feel seen. Thaddeus watched her from the edge of each conversation with the expression of a man who had purchased a simple timepiece and discovered it kept perfect time down to the second. Every handshake she offered was precisely calibrated. Every laugh she gave landed at exactly the right volume. She moved through the crowd the way a skilled musician moved through a difficult passage, with the kind of ease that only comes from years of hidden practice. They paused near the pump room to accept glasses of the mineral water. Genevieve took a sip and kept her face perfectly neutral despite the taste. "Vile, isn't it?" Thaddeus said quietly. "Like drinking a warm penny," she replied, and he very nearly laughed. It was at this moment that a tall man in a charcoal frock coat and dove-grey waistcoat approached them from across the terrace. He walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected other people to adjust their path around him, and two younger men followed a step behind, like attendants flanking a minister of state. "Lord Vane," the man said. His voice was smooth, measured, and carried the particular kind of authority that came from sitting on committees where real decisions were made. "I had heard you would be joining us for the assembly this year, and this must be the fortunate lady." "Lord Malachi," Thaddeus said, and Genevieve felt the muscles in his arm tighten just slightly beneath her hand. Allow me to introduce my betrothed, Miss Genevieve Ashford." Genevieve curtsied. "A pleasure, Lord Malachi." He took her offered hand and held it a fraction longer than custom required. His eyes moved across her face with the attentiveness of a man reading a document for the second time, looking for something he might have missed on the first pass. "You have a remarkable speaking voice, Miss Ashford," he said. "There's a quality to it, a kind of trained precision. Have you studied elocution?" The ground beneath Genevieve's composure trembled, but she held firm. "My father insisted on clear diction from a young age. He believed it was the foundation of all good character." "A wise man." Malachi released her hand. "I look forward to becoming better acquainted over the coming days. The assembly brings together the finest minds and voices of the county. I have no doubt yours will be among them." He inclined his head, offered Thaddeus a measured smile, and walked away toward the pump room. His attendants followed without a word. Genevieve waited until he was fully out of earshot before she spoke. "He suspects something." "He suspects everyone of something," Thaddeus said. "That's how he's survived this long in council politics." "He mentioned my voice, Thaddeus. Specifically, my voice." Thaddeus guided her gently toward a quieter section of the terrace, away from the nearest clusters of guests. "He may remember hearing a singer years ago who sounded like you. That doesn't mean he knows who you are." "And if he finds out?" "Then we deal with it, together." She searched his face for hesitation and found none. Whatever else Thaddeus Vane might be, proud, strategic, accustomed to control, he was proving to be a man who did not flinch at the first sign of difficulty. She turned back toward the promenade, adjusted her parasol, and settled her expression into the calm, pleasant mask she would need for the rest of the afternoon. Somewhere behind them, Lord Malachi was watching from the steps of the pump room, with a cup of mineral water in his hand and a faint crease forming between his brows. The Chancellor's palace sat on a hill above the town of Blackthorn, its pale facade lit by rows of oil lanterns that turned the stone the color of warm honey against the evening sky. Carriages lined the curved drive in a slow procession, each one depositing its passengers beneath a columned entrance where footmen in powdered wigs stood at attention like ornamental soldiers. Genevieve had never been inside the palace before, though she had once performed at a private house less than a mile from its gates. That felt like someone else's life now, a chapter from a book she had closed and shelved in a place she never intended to revisit. She wore a gown of deep emerald satin with a square neckline trimmed in seed pearls. Mrs. Hatchett had selected it specifically for this evening, explaining that green would set her apart from the sea of pastel silks that dominated every formal gathering this time of year. Genevieve's dark hair was pinned in a low chignon with a single ivory comb, and she carried a pair of cream kidskin gloves that still smelled faintly of the dressmaker's shop. Thaddeus offered his arm at the top of the entrance stairs. He wore a black tailcoat with a white silk waistcoat and looked, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely comfortable. This was his world. The discomfort he'd shown at her cottage 2 days ago had been the exception, she realized. Here, among chandeliers and title holders, he was at home. "The Chancellor will greet us in the receiving line," he said quietly as they entered the foyer. "His name is Lord Ashcroft. He is 73, half deaf in his left ear, and exceedingly fond of Handel. If he asks your opinion on music, mention Handel." "I know Handel's work intimately." "Of course you do." He paused. "Try not to know it too intimately. Enthusiasm about music in this crowd draws attention." The grand ballroom occupied the entire eastern wing of the palace. Its ceiling was painted with allegorical figures, justice holding her scales, commerce with a ship beneath her arm, wisdom reading from a scroll that seemed to follow the viewer's eye from every angle. The floor was polished oak, and 3 enormous crystal chandeliers hung at intervals along the length of the room, each one fitted with more than 100 beeswax candles. The air smelled of melted wax, rosewater, and the warm, slightly cloying scent of 200 bodies dressed in their finest. Genevieve and Thaddeus moved through the receiving line without incident. Lord Ashcroft clasped her hand with both of his and told her she had the bearing of a duchess, which she accepted with a modest dip of her chin and a smile that revealed nothing. The first hour passed in a comfortable rhythm of introductions, light conversation, and careful navigation of the room's invisible social geography. Genevieve had mapped the ballroom's hierarchy within 15 minutes. The older families clustered near the fireplace, the younger titled couples circled the dance floor, and the political men gathered near the tall windows overlooking the garden terrace, where the real conversations happened behind glasses of port. It was during the second hour that the evening took its turn. A ripple of quiet commotion passed through the room near the orchestra's alcove. The musicians had stopped playing, and the Chancellor's personal secretary was speaking in hurried tones to a stout man in a velvet coat, the evening's musical director. Genevieve watched from across the room as the director's face shifted from concern to barely concealed panic. Within minutes, the word had spread. The primary soloist, a soprano hired from Bath to perform during the formal supper interval, had been taken ill at her lodgings and could not attend. The Chancellor's carefully planned evening now had a gap at its centre, and the host's embarrassment was becoming visible in the stiffness of his shoulders and the tight line of his mouth. Thaddeus appeared at Genevieve's side. "The soprano is indisposed," he said. "The Chancellor looks as though someone has told him his favourite horse has died." Genevieve watched Lord Ashcroft across the room. The old man was trying to smile through a conversation with a baroness, but his eyes kept drifting toward the silent orchestra alcove. The musicians sat with their instruments in their laps, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. Something stirred in her chest, a pull she hadn't felt in years, familiar and frightening in equal measure. "I can do it," she said. Thaddeus looked at her sharply. "Absolutely not. If you perform publicly, you increase the risk of someone recognizing you." "The risk already exists. Malachi has been studying me since Blackthorn Springs. Whether I sing tonight or sit quietly in a corner, he will keep digging until he finds what he's looking for." She met Thaddeus's gaze. "If I perform, I control how this room sees me. I become the story of the evening, the Duke's charming betrothed who saved the Chancellor's supper. That story protects us more than silence ever could." He held her look for a long moment. She could see the calculation turning behind his eyes, the risk weighed against the reward, the danger measured against the opportunity. "Can you do it without revealing your training?" he asked. "I've been hiding my training since I was 17 years old. One more evening won't break the habit." He exhaled through his nose. "Then go." Genevieve crossed the ballroom floor and approached the Chancellor's secretary. A brief exchange followed, polite, deferential, delivered with the precise warmth of a woman offering a kindness rather than seeking a stage. The secretary's relief was immediate. He escorted her to the alcove, spoke to the musical director, and within minutes the orchestra had adjusted their program. She sat at the harpsichord. The room quieted by degrees, first the nearest tables, then the middle of the floor, and finally the clusters of men by the windows, who turned one by one to see who had taken the empty seat. Genevieve placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The piece was a slow English air, gentle and restrained at first, the kind of melody that might drift through an open window on a summer evening. Then her voice entered, and the room became very still. Her soprano filled the ballroom the way light fills a glass, completely, evenly, reaching every corner without force. The notes climbed through the painted ceiling and seemed to settle there among the allegorical figures, as though justice and wisdom had paused to listen. She controlled every breath, every phrase, with the precision of someone who had once made her living doing exactly this and had never truly lost the ability. By the time she reached the final cadence, a slow and descending passage that ended on a single sustained note, the room was silent. Then the applause began, warm, genuine, building from the front tables to the back of the hall. Genevieve lifted her eyes from the keys and found Lord Malachi standing 10 feet away, watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with admiration. It was recognition. The conservatory stood at the rear of the Chancellor's estate, connected to the main house by a covered stone walkway lined with terracotta pots of trailing jasmine. Inside, the air was thick and warm, heavy with the scent of damp earth and tropical greenery. Tall glass panels formed the walls and ceiling, letting in the grey morning light and trapping the heat from a series of iron pipes that ran beneath the flagstone floor. Palms and ferns crowded the central aisle, and somewhere near the back, water dripped steadily into a stone basin from a small copper fountain shaped like a leaping fish. Genevieve had come here to be alone. The previous evening's performance had changed her standing among the assembly guests overnight. At breakfast, 3 women she had never spoken to greeted her by name. A retired admiral's wife asked whether she might perform at a charity concert in Dorchester. The Chancellor himself had taken her hand and called her a treasure of the county. Each compliment landed on her shoulders like another stone added to a weight she was already struggling to carry. She stood near the far end of the conservatory, pretending to examine a potted orchid, when she heard footsteps on the flagstones behind her. The pace was measured and unhurried, the walk of a man who had no intention of passing through. Miss Ashford. She turned. Lord Malachi stood between 2 large fern planters, his hands clasped behind his back, wearing a dark brown morning coat and a smile that carried all the warmth of a January frost. Lord Malachi, good morning. I hoped I might find you here. The conservatory is a favourite retreat for those who prefer quiet reflection to the noise of the breakfast room. He stepped closer, stopping at a distance that was technically proper but felt deliberately intimate. I wanted to offer my personal congratulations on last evening's performance. You were extraordinary. You're very kind. I'm rarely kind, Miss Ashford. I am, however, honest. He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way he had at Blackthorn Springs, with that same careful, searching attention. Tell me, where did you train? Your voice has a quality that goes well beyond drawing-room accomplishment. The breath control alone suggests years of formal instruction. My father taught me, Genevieve said. He was a composer, as I mentioned. Music was part of our household the way prayer is part of a parsonage. Indeed, a composer from Oakhaven. Malachi paused, letting the silence do its work. It's curious, though. I've spent a good deal of my career attending performances across the south of England, opera, choral recitals, private concerts. And your voice last evening reminded me very strongly of a young singer I once heard at the Grand Opera House. Several years ago now, a remarkable talent. She disappeared rather suddenly, as I recall. The air in the conservatory seemed to thicken. Genevieve could feel the moisture from the plants settling on her skin like a second layer of clothing, and beneath her gloves, her palms had gone damp. I'm afraid I've never attended the Grand Opera House, she said. My father's health kept us close to home for most of my youth. Of course, a coincidence then. Malachi smiled again. The singer I'm thinking of was called Genevieve as well, a common enough name, I suppose. Though the resemblance is striking, the tone, the phrasing, even the way you hold your chin when you reach for the higher register. I noticed it quite clearly from where I was standing. He let the observation hang between them like smoke from a snuffed candle. Every word he chose was precise, every pause deliberate. He was testing her the way a locksmith tests a mechanism, applying pressure at different points to see which one would give. Genevieve held his gaze and kept her breathing even. Years of performing under the scrutiny of crowded theatres had taught her that the body betrayed fear long before the voice did. If she controlled her posture, her expression, and the steadiness of her hands, the words would follow. I've been told I have one of those faces that reminds people of someone else, she said lightly. Perhaps your opera singer and I share a distant ancestor. Stranger things have happened in the English countryside. Malachi chuckled, a short, dry sound that carried no amusement. Perhaps so. He opened his mouth to continue, but the sound of firm footsteps echoed from the walkway, and Thaddeus appeared through the conservatory entrance. He was dressed for the morning in a riding coat and tall boots, and his expression carried the easy confidence of a man arriving exactly where he intended to be. "Darling, there you are," he said, crossing the aisle and placing his hand lightly at the small of Genevieve's back. "I've been looking for you. Lady Ashcroft has asked whether you might join her for a walk through the rose garden before luncheon." He turned to Malachi with a smile that was perfectly polite and perfectly cold. "Lord Malachi, I trust you've been keeping my betrothed entertained." We were discussing music, Malachi said smoothly. Miss Ashford has a fascinating background. I was just remarking on how her voice reminded me of a singer I once knew. Genevieve's talents are considerable, Thaddeus said, though I confess I'm rather possessive of her time. You'll forgive me if I steal her away. By all means. Malachi stepped back and offered a shallow bow. Miss Ashford, it has been a genuine pleasure. I do hope we'll have the opportunity to continue our conversation before the assembly concludes. Genevieve curtsied. I look forward to it, Lord Malachi. Thaddeus guided her out of the conservatory and along the covered walkway without speaking. They walked past the jasmine pots, through a wooden gate, and into a small courtyard where a stone bench sat beneath an arched trellis covered in climbing roses that had long since finished blooming for the season. Only when they were fully out of sight did Thaddeus stop and turn to face her. What did he say to you? He brought up the Grand Opera House directly. He mentioned a singer named Genevieve who disappeared suddenly. He said the resemblance was striking. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. Did he accuse you? He's too clever for that. He's circling, laying pieces on the board and waiting to see how I respond to each one. He wants me to make a mistake, to flinch, to contradict myself, to offer one detail too many. And did you? I told him my father kept us close to home and that I'd never attended the opera. He didn't believe me, but he couldn't prove otherwise. For now, it's a draw. Thaddeus exhaled slowly. He looked out across the courtyard, his hands resting on his hips, his brow furrowed in the particular way it did when he was rearranging a problem in his mind. He'll keep pressing, he said. I know. Then tonight, when we're back at the manor, you tell me everything, the full truth, every detail of what happened between you and Malachi at the Grand Opera House. Because if he is going to come for us, I need to know exactly what weapons he's carrying. Genevieve looked at him for a long moment. The morning light fell through the bare trellis above and cast a lattice of shadows across his face. Tonight, she agreed. The library at Vane Manor occupied a long, narrow room on the ground floor, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes arranged by subject and date. A heavy oak desk sat near the window, covered in shipping documents and nautical charts, and two armchairs faced the fireplace where a low fire burned behind an iron grate. The curtains had been drawn against the night, and a single oil lamp on the desk cast a warm circle of light that left the far corners of the room in comfortable shadow. Genevieve sat in the armchair nearest the fire, a cup of tea cooling on the small table beside her. She had changed out of her day dress into a simple grey wool gown, the kind of thing she would have worn at her cottage, and her hair hung loosely over one shoulder. The performance of Lady Genevieve was finished for the day. In this room, at this hour, she was simply herself. Thaddeus closed the library door and turned the key. He crossed to the second armchair and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Tell me, he said. She took a breath and began. 6 years ago, I was a principal soprano at the Grand Opera House in Plymouth. I had been performing there since I was 19. My father secured my first audition through a connection he had with the musical director, a man named Pemberton, who admired his compositions and agreed to hear me sing. I was given a minor role within the first season and a principal role by the third. You must have been exceptional. I was dedicated. There's a difference. Exceptional talents filled the opera house every season. What separated me from most of them was that I understood the business as well as the music. I knew how to manage a rehearsal schedule, how to read a contract, and how to keep the books balanced when the company overspent on costumes or scenery. The books, Thaddeus said quietly. Yes, by my 4th year, the house manager trusted me enough to assist with the company's financial records. I maintained the ledger for incoming donations and ticket revenues alongside the senior treasurer. It was unpaid work, but it gave me standing within the company that most performers never achieved. She paused and stared into the fire. The coals shifted and sent a brief scatter of sparks up the chimney. Lord Malachi was one of the opera house's principal patrons. He sat on the board of benefactors and contributed generously each season, or so everyone believed. What I discovered, quite by accident, was that the donations recorded under his name in the official ledger didn't match the amounts that actually arrived. The numbers were close enough that a casual glance would miss the difference, but over 4 years, the gap amounted to nearly £200. Thaddeus straightened. He was skimming from his own donations? He was inflating them. He would pledge £50 to the company, deliver 40, and have the ledger record 50. The missing 10 would be quietly redirected, I never found out where, but the effect was that the opera house believed it was receiving more money than it actually was, and Malachi received public credit for a generosity he wasn't actually providing. And you found the discrepancy? I found it because I was meticulous. My father taught me to treat numbers the way he treated musical notation. Every figure in its proper place, every column balanced to the penny. When I noticed the pattern, I brought it to the house manager privately. I thought he would investigate. Instead, he went directly to Malachi. Thaddeus closed his eyes briefly. Of course he did. Within a fortnight, the house manager announced that a sum of £43 had gone missing from the company's operating fund. He produced a version of the ledger that showed the discrepancy falling under entries I had personally recorded. The implication was clear. I had been stealing from the company. And Malachi? Malachi sat on the review panel that examined the evidence. He expressed deep personal disappointment in me during the hearing. He said he had always admired my talent and was saddened to see it accompanied by such a flaw of character. The panel voted unanimously to dismiss me, and my name was struck from the company register. No other opera house in the south of England would hire me after that. The fire popped quietly. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock chimed 11. I returned to Oakhaven and took up transcription work to survive. My father's health had been declining for some time, and he died the following winter. The creditors came shortly after. And that is the complete and unvarnished truth of how I came to be sitting in a cottage copying wool contracts when you knocked on my door. Thaddeus was quiet for a long time. He stared at the fire with his hands clasped together, his thumbs pressing against each other in a slow, rhythmic motion. The original ledger, he said, finally. The one that showed the true figures before it was altered. Does it still exist? It must. Malachi is careful, but he is also vain. A man like that keeps records of everything, including the evidence of his own deception. He would consider it a trophy, proof of how thoroughly he outmaneuvered a young woman who dared to question him. Then it's traveling with him. Genevieve looked at Thaddeus sharply. What do you mean? Malachi never leaves sensitive documents at his London residence when he travels. His former secretary mentioned it once at a dinner, said the man keeps a private trunk of personal papers with him at all times, locked and under the watch of his valet. If the original ledger exists, it's in that trunk. And that trunk is here, somewhere between the Chancellor's estate and wherever Malachi is lodging for the assembly. You're suggesting we take it? I'm suggesting we retrieve what belongs to you, the truth, written in your hand, bearing his signature, proving that the accusation against you was manufactured. He paused and met her eyes across the firelight. You said he inflated his donations over 4 years. That means the unedited ledger will show a pattern, repeated entries in his writing, each one slightly lower than what was publicly recorded. That kind of evidence doesn't just clear your name, it destroys his. Genevieve studied him carefully. Why would you risk this for me? Your maritime license is already in danger. If we're caught interfering with a councillor's private documents, you lose everything. I lose everything if Malachi exposes you first. The moment he proves you're a fraud, my license application collapses and my family's reputation goes with it. Our fates are already tied together, Genevieve. The only question is whether we sit here and wait for him to unravel us, or whether we move first. She held his gaze. The lamp on the desk flickered once, sending a brief tremor of shadow across the bookshelves. The assembly moves to Lake Crestwood tomorrow for the boating gathering, she said slowly. Malachi's trunk will travel with him. If there is a moment when his attention is occupied and his valet is away from the luggage, that would be our opportunity. Thaddeus nodded. Then we make that moment happen. He reached across the space between their chairs and extended his hand. She looked at it, The broad palm, the steady fingers, the quiet offer of partnership from a man who had hired her as a convenience and was now choosing to stand beside her as an ally. She took his hand and held it firmly. "Together, then," she said. "Together." Lake Crestwood lay in a shallow valley 6 miles east of Blackthorn, surrounded by dense beechwood and bordered on its southern shore by a series of private estates belonging to families who had held land there since the reign of the Tudors. The lake itself was long and narrow, its surface dark and still, except where the afternoon breeze drew faint lines across the water like the strokes of an invisible pen. The boating gathering was an annual tradition among the assembly's attendees, an afternoon of leisure designed to soften the formality of the council proceedings and allow the titled families to socialize under open sky. In practice, it served the same purpose as every other gathering of its kind. Alliances were tested, favors were traded, and grudges were sharpened beneath a veneer of pleasant conversation. The pavilion stood on a stone platform at the water's edge, draped in cream linen and furnished with wicker chairs and low tables set with lemonade, cold meats, and strawberry tarts. A fleet of wooden rowing boats had been tied along a short jetty, each one painted white with the Crestwood crest on the bow. Servants moved quietly between the tables, and a pair of swans drifted near the reeds at the far end of the lake, wholly indifferent to the social machinery operating on the shore. Genevieve arrived with Thaddeus shortly after 2 o'clock. The afternoon was warm for the season, and she wore a light cream muslin dress with a sage-green sash tied beneath the bodice. Her bonnet was trimmed with a single ribbon, and she carried a folded fan that Mrs. Hatchett had insisted upon, despite Genevieve's protest that she had perfectly functional hands for cooling herself. Thaddeus leaned toward her as they approached the pavilion. "Malachi arrived an hour ago. His carriage is parked at the lake house on the northern shore, the stone building through the trees there. His valet and luggage are inside." Genevieve followed his gaze across the water. Through a gap in the beaches, she could make out the shape of a grey stone building with a slate roof and narrow windows. It sat apart from the main gathering, private and quiet, exactly the kind of place a cautious man would store his personal belongings while attending a lakeside social function. "How do we draw him away from it?" she asked. "We don't need to draw him away from the building. He's already here at the pavilion. What we need is to keep him here long enough for you to observe the movements of his valet and identify where the trunk is being stored." "And how do you intend to keep him occupied?" Thaddeus adjusted his cuffs with a casualness that was entirely deliberate. "I'm going to pick a fight with him about shipping tariffs." Genevieve glanced sideways at him. "You're going to argue about tariffs? At a boating party?" There is no subject on earth more capable of trapping a man like Malachi in an endless conversation. He sits on the tariff review board. If I challenge his position on Baltic lumber duties in front of the right audience, he won't be able to walk away without losing face. It could tie him up for an hour. That's either brilliant or deeply tedious. It can be both. They separated at the pavilion steps. Thaddeus moved toward a cluster of gentlemen standing near the jetty, where Malachi was holding court with a glass of claret and the self-satisfied posture of a man who believed every word leaving his own mouth was of national importance. Genevieve watched from a distance as Thaddeus joined the group, accepted a glass from a passing servant, and within 5 minutes had steered the conversation toward the question of whether current tariff structures unfairly penalized independent English shippers. Malachi's reaction was immediate. His chin lifted, his shoulders squared, and he set his glass down on the railing with the precision of a man preparing for battle. Within moments, the discussion had sharpened into a genuine debate, and several other gentlemen had gathered to listen with the keen attention of spectators at a cockfight. Genevieve moved. She drifted away from the pavilion along the shoreline path, pausing occasionally to admire the view or bend toward a cluster of wildflowers growing near the water's edge. To anyone watching, she was a young woman taking a solitary stroll while her betrothed discussed business. There was nothing unusual about it. Ladies frequently wandered the grounds during these gatherings, preferring fresh air to the tedium of men's commerce. The path curved through the beech trees and brought her within sight of the lake house. She slowed her pace and settled on a wooden bench positioned beneath an old oak, opening her fan and holding it at an angle that partially obscured her face while leaving her view of the building unobstructed. For 20 minutes she watched. The lake house had a single entrance facing the water and a side door that opened onto a small yard where Malachi's carriage was parked. The horses had been unhitched and led to a post near the tree line. A coachman sat on an upturned crate, smoking a pipe and reading a folded newspaper. At 2:30, the side door opened and Malachi's valet emerged carrying a clothes brush and a pair of polished shoes. He crossed the yard, spoke briefly to the coachman, and then walked toward the pavilion, likely to confirm arrangements for his master's evening wardrobe. The coachman remained at his post, but his attention was fixed entirely on his newspaper. Genevieve noted the timing carefully. The valet had been gone from the building for approximately 4 minutes before returning. During that window, the side door had remained unlocked. She also observed something else. As the valet re-entered the lake house, he turned left immediately inside the doorway, not toward the main room, which would have been straight ahead, but toward a smaller chamber on the ground floor. Through the narrow window, she caught a brief glimpse of stacked luggage, and among it, the distinct shape of a leather-bound document trunk with brass fittings and a heavy clasp. She closed her fan and stood from the bench. By the time she returned to the pavilion, Thaddeus was deep in what appeared to be a spirited exchange about the comparative costs of importing Norwegian pine versus Scottish oak. Malachi's face had taken on a faintly flushed quality, and 2 younger lords were nodding along with expressions that suggested they had stopped following the argument several minutes ago, but were too polite to leave. Genevieve caught Thaddeus's eye from across the pavilion and gave a single, slight nod. He acknowledged it with the barest shift of his gaze before returning to the tariff debate with renewed energy, launching into a detailed comparison of harbour fees at Bristol and Southampton that made Malachi's left eye twitch with irritation. Genevieve sat down near the lemonade table, accepted a strawberry tart from a passing servant, and allowed herself one small, private smile. She knew exactly where the trunk was. She knew the layout of the building. She knew the valet's routine and the coachman's habits. Tonight, when the estate fell quiet and the candles burned low, they would go back. The moon sat low behind a thin veil of cloud, casting just enough light to see the path, but leaving the spaces between the trees in deep darkness. The beechwood smelled of damp leaves and cool earth, and the only sounds were the occasional call of a tawny owl somewhere in the upper canopy and the soft crunch of gravel beneath careful feet. Genevieve moved along the shoreline path she had walked that afternoon, though the landscape felt entirely different at this hour. The lake was black and flat, reflecting nothing. The pavilion stood empty and ghostly, with its linen drapes removed, the wicker chairs stacked against the railing like sleeping sentinels. The festive warmth of the afternoon had been replaced by the particular stillness that settles over grand estates after the last candle in the last window has been snuffed. She wore a dark wool dress borrowed from Mrs. Hatchett's wardrobe, practical, close-fitting, and blessedly free of the rustling petticoats that accompanied her finer gowns. Her hair was tied back with a plain strip of linen, and she carried a small leather roll tucked inside her sleeve, containing 3 thin metal tools of varying lengths. Thaddeus walked beside her, dressed in a dark coat with no waistcoat, his usual polished boots replaced by a pair of soft-soled shoes he had borrowed from his own stablemaster. He looked profoundly uncomfortable in the outfit, which made Genevieve suspect he had never dressed below his station for any purpose in his entire life. They stopped at the edge of the beechwood, where the trees thinned and the yard of the lake house became visible. The building was dark. No lamp burned in any window. The carriage remained where it had been that afternoon, though the horses had been moved to a temporary stable behind the main Crestwood estate. The coachman's crate was empty. "The valet sleeps in the upstairs room," Genevieve whispered. "I saw a candle in the upper window earlier this evening. It went out just after 10. "And the side door?" "Unlocked when I observed it this afternoon. Country houses rarely bolt the service entrances unless there's specific cause for concern. Malachi has no reason to think anyone would target his luggage here." Thaddeus studied the building for a long moment, then looked at her. "I'll stay at the perimeter. If anyone approaches from the main estate, I'll signal, 2 short whistles. If you hear that, leave everything and come straight back along the path. And if the door is locked? Can you open it? Genevieve unrolled the leather case inside her sleeve and held it so that the moonlight caught the 3 slender metal picks resting inside. They were elegant tools, fine as knitting needles with delicate curves at their tips. During my years at the Opera House, I managed the stage properties, she said. Half the show involved locked doors, sealed chests, and hidden compartments. The prop master taught me how every common English lock worked so that I could manage the mechanisms during scene changes. I've opened everything from a Georgian writing desk to a naval captain's strongbox. Thaddeus stared at the picks, then at her. Is there anything about your past that isn't going to surprise me? I expect you'll find out over the next hour. She crossed the yard quickly and quietly, keeping to the shadow of the carriage. The side door was a plain wooden panel with a simple iron latch. She pressed the handle. It lifted without resistance, unlocked, just as she had expected. She slipped inside and stood still for a full 30 seconds, letting her eyes adjust. The ground floor of the lake house was divided into 3 rooms, a main sitting area straight ahead, a small pantry to the right, and to the left, the storage chamber she had glimpsed through the window that afternoon. The air smelled of old wood, pipe smoke, and the faint mineral tang of the lake. She turned left. The storage chamber was narrow, with a single window set high in the wall. Moonlight entered in a pale rectangle that fell across a stack of traveling cases, hat boxes, and garment trunks arranged along the far wall. And there, beneath a folded carriage blanket, sat the document trunk. It was exactly as she remembered, dark brown leather with brass corner fittings and a heavy clasp secured by a 3-lever lock. She knelt beside it and drew out her picks. The lock was a Chubb, a reliable make, popular among gentlemen who wanted security without the expense of a full Brahma mechanism. Genevieve had opened this type dozens of times backstage. The trick was patience. Each lever had to be lifted to its correct height before the bolt would slide, and the tolerances were tight enough that rushing would cause the mechanism to reset. She inserted the tension pick and applied gentle pressure, then fed the lifting tool into the keyway. The first lever responded within seconds. The second required a slight adjustment of angle. The third, the stiffest, held for nearly a minute before yielding with a faint click that sounded, in the silence of the room, like a pistol shot. The clasp released. She lifted the lid. Inside, the trunk was divided into 3 compartments. The first held correspondence, sealed letters, folded notes, a bundle of legal documents tied with red ribbon. The second contained personal items, a silver pocket watch, a leather-bound diary, a pair of reading spectacles in a velvet case. The third compartment, separated from the others by a wooden divider, held a set of bound ledgers, 3 of them, each one labeled with a year on the spine in precise copperplate handwriting. Genevieve's hands trembled as she lifted the oldest volume and opened it. The pages were ruled and filled with columns of figures, donations received, amounts recorded, dates of deposit. And there, on the 3rd page, in a hand she recognized as her own, were the original entries she had made during her time as assistant treasurer of the Grand Opera House. The figures were clean, unaltered, and beside each entry, countersigned in Malachi's distinctive slanting script, were the true amounts he had actually delivered, consistently lower than the figures that had appeared in the public ledger used to condemn her. This was the original record, the one that proved the official version had been falsified, the one that showed Malachi's signature next to the real numbers, numbers that he had later inflated to match his public reputation as a generous patron. She closed the ledger and pressed it against her chest. For a long moment, she knelt there in the moonlight, breathing quietly, feeling the weight of 6 years of silence and disgrace gathered in the binding of a single book. Then she replaced the other ledgers exactly as she had found them, closed the trunk, and reset the clasp. She could not relock the Chubb without the original key, but she positioned the clasp in a way that would pass a cursory visual inspection. If Malachi's valet didn't test the lock directly, the tampering would go unnoticed for at least a day. She tucked the ledger inside her dress, pressed flat against her ribs, and held in place by the tight lacing of her stays. It was uncomfortable, but invisible. She crossed the storage room, paused at the doorway to listen, and slipped back through the side entrance into the yard. The night air struck her face like cold water, and she allowed herself one full breath before moving toward the tree line. Thaddeus was waiting exactly where she had left him, leaning against a beech trunk with his arms folded and his face tight, with the particular strain of a man who had spent 20 minutes listening to every sound in the darkness and interpreting each one as a disaster. "Well," he said. Genevieve reached into her dress and produced the ledger. She held it up so the moonlight caught the gold lettering on the spine. Thaddeus exhaled slowly, and something in his posture released, a tension that had been building since the moment they left the manor. "Is it enough?" he asked. "His signature is on every page. The true figures are recorded in my handwriting alongside the falsified ones he submitted to the review panel. It proves the discrepancy existed before I was ever accused, and it proves he knew about it because he countersigned every entry." Thaddeus looked at the ledger, then at her. In the pale wash of the moonlight, his expression held something she hadn't seen from him before, a kind of respect that went beyond admiration for a task well performed. It was the look of a man who had just watched someone reclaim a piece of themselves that had been stolen years ago. "We present it to the Chancellor tomorrow morning," he said. "Tomorrow morning," she agreed. They turned together and walked back through the beechwood toward the waiting carriage, the stolen ledger pressed between them like a shared secret, and the moon breaking free of its clouds at last. The morning began with certainty and ended with ambush. Genevieve had slept fewer than 4 hours, but she woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The ledger sat on the writing desk in her guest suite, wrapped in a linen cloth and placed inside a leather folio that Thaddeus had provided from his study. She dressed quickly, a dove-grey morning gown with pearl buttons and a modest lace collar, and pinned her hair with the kind of deliberate care reserved for days when every detail mattered. Thaddeus was waiting for her in the entrance hall, already wearing his best morning coat and carrying a sealed letter he had written overnight, a formal request to the Chancellor for a private audience before the day's council proceedings began. The plan was simple. They would travel to the council chambers at Blackthorn, present the ledger directly to Lord Ashcroft, and request an official inquiry into Lord Malachi's financial dealings with the Grand Opera House. The evidence was clear. The signatures were authentic, and the ledger's age could be verified by any competent clerk. For the first time since their arrangement began, Genevieve felt the ground beneath her was solid. The carriage was brought around at 7:30. Thaddeus handed her up the step, passed the leather folio to her personally rather than entrusting it to any servant, and climbed in beside her. The coachman cracked the reins, and the horses moved off down the elm-lined drive toward the main road. They had covered less than a mile when the carriage slowed. Genevieve looked through the window and saw a second carriage stopped diagonally across the road just past the old stone bridge, the same bridge they had crossed on her first day at Vane Manor. A man in a dark overcoat stood beside it with his arm raised, signalling their driver to halt. "Who is that?" she asked. Thaddeus leaned forward and peered through the glass. His face changed. "That's Malachi's chief steward, a man named Hargrove." The carriage came to a full stop. Through the thin walls, Genevieve could hear a brief exchange between their coachman and the man on the road. The words were indistinct, but the tone was formal and clipped, the kind of language used when delivering official documents rather than making polite inquiries. The coachman's hatch opened above their heads. "Begging your pardon, my lord. The gentleman says he carries a petition from Lord Malachi addressed to the High Council of Barons. He insists it be noted that the petition was delivered before your arrival at the council chambers this morning." Thaddeus's expression hardened. He opened the carriage door and stepped down onto the road. Genevieve followed. Hargrove was a lean man of about 45, with a narrow face and the professional blankness of someone trained to deliver difficult messages without personal investment in their content. He held a sealed document in his right hand, and he offered it to Thaddeus with a shallow bow. "Lord Vane, I have been instructed by Lord Malachi to deliver this petition to the council clerk's office. As a courtesy, I am informing you of its contents in advance." He paused, and for the first time, the faintest trace of discomfort crossed his face. The petition alleges that you have knowingly presented a fraudulent companion to the assembly, a woman of no noble standing, posing under a false title for the purpose of deceiving the trade committee and securing your maritime license through misrepresentation. The words landed in the morning air with the weight of a dropped anchor. Genevieve felt the blood leave her face. Beside her, Thaddeus stood absolutely still, his jaw locked and his hands motionless at his sides. "On what grounds does Lord Malachi make this claim?" Thaddeus asked. His voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it, the controlled tension of a man holding something in place by force of will alone. The petition states that Lord Malachi has identified Miss Ashford as a former performer at the Grand Opera House in Plymouth, a woman dismissed from service for financial misconduct 6 years ago. He further alleges that she possesses no legitimate claim to the title she has been introduced under, and that the betrothal is a fabrication designed to satisfy the Guild's requirements for your license renewal. And the council has received this? A copy was delivered to the clerk's office by messenger at dawn, my lord. I am told the presiding chancellor has already reviewed it. Thaddeus took the document from Hargrove's hand. He broke the seal and read it standing on the road, his eyes moving line by line through the formal language. Genevieve watched his face and saw each paragraph register, the accusation, the evidence cited, the recommended course of action. He folded the petition and placed it inside his coat. "Thank you, Hargrove. You may tell Lord Malachi that I have received his courtesy notice." The steward bowed again and returned to his carriage without another word. Within moments, the vehicle had turned and was heading back toward Blackthorn. Thaddeus stood on the road for a long time after it had gone. The morning was bright and cool, and a pair of wood pigeons called to each other from the trees along the bridge. Genevieve waited beside him, the leather folio clutched against her chest, her mind turning through the implications of what had just happened. "He moved first," she said quietly. "He moved before dawn." Thaddeus turned to face her. He must have discovered the trunk was tampered with and guessed immediately. A man like Malachi doesn't wait for confirmation. He strikes at the first sign of threat. What does this mean for the council? It means that when we arrive at the chambers this morning, we won't be presenting evidence. We'll be answering charges. The Chancellor will have to acknowledge the petition formally, and that means a hearing, likely a full tribunal. Can they ban you from the Guild? If the tribunal finds that I deliberately presented an impostor to the Trade Committee, they can revoke my family's maritime license permanently. 3 generations of shipping access, gone in an afternoon. Genevieve felt the weight of those words settle across her shoulders. The ledger she carried, the proof of her innocence, the record of Malachi's fraud, was supposed to have been their weapon. Instead, they would now walk into the council chambers as defendants. When will the tribunal be held? Tomorrow morning, most likely. The council prefers to resolve internal disputes before they poison the rest of the assembly's business. They'll summon both parties and hear arguments in the formal chamber. The horses shifted restlessly in their harnesses. The coachman waited in silence on his bench, his eyes fixed politely on the horizon. Genevieve looked down at the folio in her hands. The leather was warm where she had been pressing it against her ribs. Inside it, the ledger sat with its columns of numbers and countersigned entries, the truth she had spent 6 years waiting to speak. "Then we present it at the tribunal," she said. Thaddeus studied her face. "If you present that ledger at a public hearing, you'll have to reveal who you really are. In front of the entire assembly, every family, every lord, every councillor who has spent the past week believing you were Lady Genevieve of Oakhaven." "I know. There will be no going back. The arrangement, the pretense, the title, all of it collapses the moment you speak." "I know that too." He searched her expression for doubt and found none. Whatever fear she carried, and she carried plenty, it was buried deep beneath something harder. Something that had been growing since the moment she knelt in the moonlight of that storage room and held the proof of her stolen life in her own hands. "Very well," Thaddeus said. He opened the carriage door and offered her his hand. "Then tomorrow morning, we finish this." She took his hand, stepped up into the carriage, and settled the folio across her lap. The horses moved forward, and the old stone bridge passed beneath them for what Genevieve suspected would be the last time she crossed it as anyone other than herself. The council chamber occupied the oldest wing of the Chancellor's palace, a high-ceilinged hall built of dark English oak, with tall arched windows that let in columns of pale morning light. The walls were hung with portraits of former chancellors dating back 2 centuries, each one staring down from their gilded frames with the solemn expression of men who had spent their lives deciding the fates of others. A long judicial bench stood at the far end of the chamber, raised on a platform 2 steps above the main floor. Behind it sat 5 chairs reserved for the presiding panel, Lord Ashcroft in the centre, flanked by 2 senior barons and 2 guild representatives. Before the bench, 2 lecterns faced each other across the open floor, positioned like opposing pulpits in a church built for argument rather than prayer. The gallery seats along both walls were filled. Word of the tribunal had spread through the assembly overnight, and every family with a name worth protecting had sent at least 1 representative to witness the proceedings. Ladies sat in the upper gallery behind a carved wooden screen, their fans moving in quiet agitation. Gentlemen occupied the lower benches, their expressions ranging from studied neutrality to open curiosity. Genevieve entered through the main doors beside Thaddeus. She wore a simple ivory dress, no embroidery, no jewels, no pearls at the collar. Mrs. Hatchett had offered her the emerald gown from the ballroom evening, but Genevieve had declined. She was done performing the role of a woman she had never been. If this was to be her final appearance before the assembly, she would face them as herself. The leather folio rested in her hands, held firmly against her waist. Lord Malachi was already positioned at the left lectern, dressed in a formal black coat with a starched white cravat. His expression carried the composed satisfaction of a man who believed the morning's outcome had already been decided. Beside him stood Hargrove, holding a stack of papers arranged with military precision. Lord Ashcroft opened the proceedings with a brief statement read from a prepared document. The tribunal had been convened to examine a petition filed by Lord Malachi, alleging that Lord Thaddeus Vane had presented a fraudulent companion to the Assembly under a false noble title, thereby violating the charter of the Maritime Guild and undermining the integrity of the council's proceedings. "Lord Malachi," the Chancellor said, "you may present your case." Malachi stepped forward and placed both hands on the lectern. He spoke the way a man carves stone, each word measured, each sentence shaped to serve a larger design. "My lords, I bring this petition with no personal malice, only a deep commitment to the standards upon which this council was founded. Over the past several days, I have observed the woman introduced to this assembly as Lady Genevieve of Oakhaven, a title I have been unable to verify through any registry of noble families in the southern counties." He paused and allowed his gaze to drift across the gallery, ensuring every face was turned toward him. Through careful observation of her manner, her speech, and in particular, her remarkable musical performance at the Chancellor's dinner, I have come to the firm conclusion that this woman is in fact Genevieve Ashford, a former soprano at the Grand Opera House in Plymouth, who was dismissed from service 6 years ago following the discovery of financial irregularities in the company's accounts. A murmur passed through the gallery. Fans moved faster. Several gentlemen on the lower benches exchanged glances. "It is my contention," Malachi continued, "that Lord Vane, facing the prospect of losing his family's maritime license for failure to present a suitable companion, recruited this woman to impersonate a noblewoman and deceive the council. I ask the panel to investigate this matter fully and to consider revoking the Vane maritime license on grounds of deliberate fraud." He stepped back from the lectern and folded his hands behind his back. The chamber was silent. Lord Ashcroft turned his gaze to the opposite lectern. "Lord Vane, you may respond." Thaddeus began to rise from his seat, but Genevieve placed her hand on his arm. He looked at her, and something passed between them, a question asked and answered without a single word. She stood. The gallery stirred. A woman approaching the respondent's lectern without invitation was unusual enough to draw murmured commentary from the upper and lower benches alike. Lord Ashcroft raised his eyebrows but did not object. Genevieve set the leather folio on the lectern and opened it. Then she looked directly at the presiding panel and spoke. "My lords, Lord Malachi is correct. I am not Lady Genevieve of Oakhaven. That title was invented, and my presence at this assembly was arranged under a private contract with Lord Vane. I stand before you as Genevieve Ashford, daughter of the late composer William Ashford and former principal soprano of the Grand Opera House in Plymouth." The murmur in the gallery became a wave. Several ladies in the upper seats leaned forward behind the screen. Lord Ashcroft raised his hand for silence, and the chamber gradually settled. "I do not stand here to apologize," Genevieve continued. "I stand here to present evidence that the man who has accused me of fraud is himself guilty of a far greater one." She drew the ledger from the folio and held it up so the panel could see the binding and the dated spine. "This is the original financial ledger of the Grand Opera House, covering the period during which Lord Malachi served as a principal patron. It contains donation records written in my own hand during my time as assistant treasurer, countersigned on every page by Lord Malachi himself." She opened the ledger to the third page and laid it flat on the lectern. "The entries in this book show the actual amounts Lord Malachi delivered to the opera company each quarter. These figures are consistently lower than the amounts recorded in the public ledger, the one used to condemn me 6 years ago. Lord Malachi inflated his reported donations over a period of 4 years, redirecting the difference for his own purposes. When I discovered the discrepancy and reported it to the house manager, Lord Malachi arranged for the public ledger to be altered and for the blame to be placed on me." She looked directly at Malachi. He had not moved from his position, but the colour had left his face entirely. His hands, still clasped behind his back, had gone rigid. "I was dismissed from the opera house. My professional reputation was destroyed, and I was forced to return to a village where I spent 6 years copying shipping contracts for 3 shillings a page. Every door that had been open to me was closed, on the strength of evidence that Lord Malachi himself fabricated." She turned back to the panel and slid the ledger across the lectern toward Lord Ashcroft. "I offer this ledger for your examination. Every entry is dated, written in identifiable hands, and countersigned. I ask that a qualified clerk compare these figures against the public record Lord Malachi submitted 6 years ago. The discrepancy will speak for itself." The Chancellor reached for the ledger and opened it. He studied the first 3 pages in silence, running his finger along the columns of figures. One of the guild representatives leaned across and examined the countersignatures, then looked up at Malachi with an expression that had shifted from impartial to something considerably colder. Lord Ashcroft closed the ledger and set it carefully before him. "Lord Malachi," he said, "do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Malachi opened his mouth. For the first time since the tribunal had begun, he appeared to have no prepared sentence waiting. His eyes moved from the ledger to Genevieve, to the panel and back again, searching for a foothold that was no longer there. "The woman is a confessed impostor," he said, and his voice had lost its carved precision. "Her testimony cannot be trusted. The ledger she presents may well have been altered or fabricated to serve her own purposes." "The ledger bears your signature, Lord Malachi," Ashcroft said, "on every page. If you contend it has been forged, we will require you to submit samples of your hand for comparison by the council's clerk. Are you prepared to do so?" The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the chamber understood the trap. If the signatures were genuine, and every indication suggested they were, then submitting handwriting samples would confirm the ledger's authenticity beyond dispute. Malachi said nothing. Lord Ashcroft nodded slowly. "This tribunal is suspended until the council's senior clerk has examined the ledger in full. Lord Malachi, you will remain within the palace grounds until the examination is complete. Lord Vane, your license application will be held in abeyance pending the outcome." He looked at Genevieve. "Miss Ashford, this council thanks you for your testimony. You are dismissed with the court's protection." Genevieve closed the folio, stepped back from the lectern, and walked to where Thaddeus stood waiting beside the gallery rail. He offered her his arm, and she took it. They walked out of the chamber together, through the corridor, past the portraits and the arched windows and the clusters of stunned faces, and into the bright morning light of the courtyard. Neither of them spoke until the palace doors had closed behind them. "You were magnificent," Thaddeus said quietly. Genevieve exhaled, a long, shaking breath she had been holding since she first opened her mouth at the lectern. "I was terrified," she said. "Those two things are not as different as you might think." The council's senior clerk took less than 3 hours. By midday, the examination was complete. The ledger's entries were verified against ink composition, paper age, and the handwriting samples Lord Malachi had been compelled to provide under formal council order. Every countersignature matched. Every figure aligned with the pattern Genevieve had described. The discrepancies between the original ledger and the public record used to condemn her 6 years ago were consistent, deliberate, and unmistakably authored by one man. The council reconvened at 2 o'clock. Genevieve was not present for the final proceedings. Thaddeus had insisted she remain at the manor while he attended the session, but the outcome reached her within the hour through a breathless footman who had ridden directly from the palace. Lord Malachi had been formally charged with financial fraud, falsification of public records, and the knowing destruction of a citizen's professional standing through manufactured evidence. His seat on the council was revoked immediately. His assets within the jurisdiction of the Maritime Guild were frozen, and he was placed under house arrest at the Chancellor's estate pending a full criminal inquiry. 2 constables had escorted him from the chamber in view of the assembled gallery, and according to the footman, Malachi had not spoken a single word as he was led away. The second piece of news was shorter and carried considerably more warmth. The council had voted unanimously to approve the Vane family's maritime license for a further 10-year term. Lord Ashcroft had personally noted in his closing remarks that Lord Vane's conduct during the tribunal, his willingness to stand beside a woman under accusation rather than distance himself, reflected the kind of character the Guild wished to see among its members. Genevieve received both pieces of information while standing in the entrance hall of Vane Manor, still wearing the ivory dress from the morning. She thanked the footman, closed the front door, and walked to the drawing room, where she sat down in the armchair beside the cold fireplace and pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. It was finished. 6 years of silence. 6 years of ink-stained fingers and 3-shilling pages and creditors' letters arriving with the regularity of seasons. 6 years of carrying a lie that someone else had written and watching it define the borders of her life. And now, in a single morning, the truth had been spoken aloud in a room full of people who mattered, and the man who had stolen her name had been made to answer for it. She sat there for a long time, letting the stillness of the house settle around her. Mrs. Hatchett found her an hour later and informed her, in a tone that suggested argument would be unwise, that preparations for a celebration dinner were already underway and that Genevieve was expected to dress appropriately. A bath had been drawn, a gown had been laid out, and the kitchen staff were producing a meal that the housekeeper described simply as considerable. By 7 o'clock, Vane Manor had been transformed. Candles burned in every window. The dining room table had been set with the family's best porcelain and silver, and garlands of ivy and late-season roses trailed along the sideboard. A string trio had been brought in from the village, old Fenton among them, playing the viola with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had recommended Genevieve to Thaddeus in the first place, and was now watching the result of his suggestion unfold beyond anything he could have imagined. The guest list was small but warm. Lady Ashcroft had sent her personal congratulations along with a case of French wine. 2 neighbouring families who had attended the tribunal arrived with flowers and expressions of genuine admiration. Mrs. Hatchett, who under normal circumstances would never have joined a formal dinner, was persuaded by Thaddeus to take a seat at the far end of the table, where she ate sparingly, spoke rarely, and watched Genevieve throughout the evening with the particular look of a woman whose professional judgment had been thoroughly vindicated. Genevieve wore the emerald gown. It felt different tonight, less like a costume and more like something that belonged to her. After supper, as the guests moved into the drawing room for coffee and the string trio began a slow country air, Thaddeus caught her eye from across the room and inclined his head toward the far corridor. She excused herself from a conversation with Fenton's wife and followed. He led her through the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with potted ferns and orange trees that Mrs. Hatchett maintained with fierce devotion, and out through a pair of French doors onto a stone balcony overlooking the southern grounds. The moon was high and nearly full, and its light turned the distant sea into a sheet of hammered silver. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of salt and cut grass. Thaddeus leaned against the stone balustrade and looked out at the water. He was still wearing his formal dinner coat, though he had loosened his cravat and unfastened the top button of his collar, the most undone she had ever seen him in company. "I received this from my solicitor this afternoon," he said, reaching inside his coat and producing a folded document. He held it out to her. Genevieve took it and opened it. She recognized it immediately. It was the original contract, the agreement she had signed in her cottage 7 days ago, binding her to the role of Thaddeus's false betrothed in exchange for the settlement of her father's debts. "Your debts have been paid in full," he said, "as of this morning. The solicitor confirmed it before the tribunal began. The terms of the contract have been fulfilled." She looked at the document in her hands, the neat legal script, the 2 signatures at the bottom, the wax seal that had bound them together for a single week. Thaddeus turned to face her. The moonlight caught the edge of his jaw and the quiet steadiness in his eyes. "I don't want the contract anymore," he said. He took the document gently from her hands, held it at the corner, and tore it cleanly in half. Then he tore it again. The pieces drifted from his fingers and scattered across the stone floor of the balcony like fallen leaves. "I didn't bring you here to perform a role, Genevieve. I brought you here because I needed someone convincing, and you were extraordinary beyond anything I had the right to expect. But somewhere between that first morning in your cottage and this evening, the arrangement stopped being an arrangement." He paused, and for the first time since she had known him, the composure that he wore like armor showed a crack. His voice, when it came again, was quieter than she had ever heard it. "I am asking you, as myself, with no contract and no condition, whether you would consider marrying me. As you are, Genevieve Ashford, the transcriber, the singer, the woman who corrected my housekeeper's bread plate on her first evening in this house, and who stood before a tribunal this morning and told the truth when every easier path led somewhere else." The night was still around them. The string trio's music drifted faintly through the conservatory doors, and the sea glimmered on the horizon, and the torn pieces of the contract lay scattered at their feet like evidence of a promise that had outlived its purpose. Genevieve looked at him, at the man who had knocked on her door with a desperate scheme and a leather document case, and had, day by day, become someone she trusted in a way she had believed was no longer available to her. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he first took the contract from his coat. She stepped forward, and he took her hands, both of them, held firmly in his, and they stood together on the balcony, above the moonlit grounds of Vane Manor, with the music playing softly behind them, and the whole wide sea stretched out ahead, bright and open, and full of the kind of promise that doesn't require a signature to make it real.